Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about Uranus and Gemini and the United States, and specifically the history of astrologers making predictions about Uranus and Gemini coinciding with major wars in the history of the country over the past few centuries. All right, so right now, I'm recording this today on what is it? It's Monday. No, it's Sunday, July 6th, 2025, starting at 8:28 p.m. in Denver, Colorado, just at sunset before the sun goes down. And it's the eve of Uranus moving into Gemini, which is going to happen later tonight, technically on the 7th of July, 2025, but just in a few hours here. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Astrologers have been anticipating it. I've been anticipating it for many years, and now we're finally here. So, this is a big deal because astrologers for quite some time now have noticed this correlation where every 84 years, when Uranus moves into the sign of Gemini, where it spends for about 7 years, the US is involved in a major war. And in fact, there's been three major instances of this so far in US history. So here's a diagram that Madeline Decotes from honeycomb.co made for me to help demonstrate this. So the first time in US history that's relevant when Uranus was in Gemini was from 1774 until 1782. And this pretty well coincided with the Revolutionary War when America declared its independence and fought a war of independence from Great Britain. Then 84 years later, when Uranus went through all the other signs of the zodiac and then eventually came back around to Gemini, where it was when the country was founded, um, it was in Gemini from 1858 until 1866, which very nicely coincided with the Civil War. Then 84 years later, Uranus goes through all the signs and it comes back eventually in a full cycle from 1941 until 1949, which coincided with the US's entry into World War II and the culmination of that war. Then finally, 84 years later, brings us to now, which is Uranus is going into Gemini tonight and tomorrow, July 7th, 2025, and it's going to stay in Gemini until 2033. So that pattern and that repetition has been known about for as long as I've been an astrologer. I've been studying astrology since 1999, which is over 25 years now. And I know astrologers have been talking about this and have known about this repetition since at least then. And we've talked about it many, many times on the podcast over the years, especially on the forecast episodes. But I've also done two episodes entirely dedicated to studying that pattern in history with my friend Nick Dagan best. The first one was episode 11 of the Astrology Podcast back in 2013. And then in 2022, we did an even more detailed treatment of looking at that pattern and that repeating cycle in history. So, one of the things that I've been researching lately in order to take stock of this and give some perspective to people in terms of the history of predictions surrounding this cycle is the question of, how long have astrologers been aware of these repetitions and how long have they been making predictions about it, about the future of the US based on this recurring cycle? And the answer to that question is actually really interesting because it turns out that um, it goes back to the first repetition and the second repetition. And there's two astrologers, very notable astrologers in US history that I want to talk about today, who made predictions and discussed the return of Uranus to Gemini before or as it was happening, right as the US was on the cusp of first the Civil War, which is the first time an astrologer named Luke Broughton first seems to have noticed and documented and made some predictions about the Civil War based on that transit. And then again, 84 years later, there was an astrologer named Evangeline Adams, who was a famous astrologer in America, perhaps the most famous astrologer of her day. And she made a prediction about World War II starting about a decade before it happened, based on the Uranus return of the United States, which was impending at that point. So I want to talk about those two and the origins of those predictions. And I also want to ground it a little bit in the chart that we look at for the United States and like why that is. And then, of course, talk a little bit about the context towards the end where we find ourselves today. All right. So where do we start? Let's start with the Sibley chart of the United States or the birth chart of the United States, because I think this is where you have to start in order to understand why this has been the particular manifestation that it often is for the United States. So the United States, in the United States, we commonly celebrate the birth of the United States based on the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is traditionally celebrated on July 4th, 1776. And then every year, the US holds birthday celebrations on that day. There are different like arguments about what the correct chart is for the United States and whether there's other dates that could be considered or used, or especially different rising signs, because there's a lot of debate over the correct rising sign for the United States because we don't have an exact record of when the signing of the Declaration of Independence happened on July 4th, 1776. But one of the most commonly used charts that I'll talk about and I'll use for the purpose of this is the Sibley chart that has Sagittarius rising. And my purpose isn't really to get into debates about the time, but primarily we're going to focus on just the location of Mars and Uranus in this chart today, and the birth time itself is kind of somewhat immaterial. All right, so here is the Sibley chart of the United States, or the birth chart of the United States, set for July 4th, 1776. So one of the things that we can see is that Uranus was in Gemini in the birth chart of the United States. So that's one of the reasons that it sets up that pattern, because that means every 84 years, Uranus is going to come back to its natal position when it goes through Gemini. But there's something additionally important about that placement that makes it unique besides just Uranus being in Gemini. And it's actually the fact that Uranus is conjunct the planet Mars, which is also in Gemini at 21 degrees of that sign. And although they're kind of far away from each other by degree, they're still what I would call co-present in that sign together, and therefore their energies are being blended together in a significant way. So Mars is typically the planet of like war and conflict and division traditionally, going back to ancient times, whereas Uranus is a relatively newly discovered planet that was discovered a few centuries ago, around the time when the United States was founded. And as a result of that, astrologers over the past couple of centuries have repeatedly seen Uranus and its placement in charts, as well as its transits, be associated with revolutionary things, with sudden urges for freedom and liberation, with unexpected changes and sometimes disruptive changes and upsets, and things that are like surprising or eccentric or other things like that. So when you put Mars and Uranus together in a chart, it can be kind of a volatile combination. And this is something I've been talking about on some of the forecast episodes over the past year. We just had a Mars-Uranus square last month that coincided with a lot of explosions and military actions, like an unexpected military action or a surprise attack against Iran from on the part of Israel and the United States. And then last summer, there were also some explosive things that occurred under a Mars-Uranus conjunction in Taurus. So, one of the things about that Mars-Uranus conjunction then is it puts this kind of explosive, divisive energy right in the birth chart of the United States. And on the one hand, there can be things about the Mars-Uranus conjunction that are kind of can be constructive and useful. It can be like bold and like risk-taking and innovative. And some of those things, especially innovative when it comes to like new technologies or transportation or communication methods and other things like that, are part of that conjunction. And there can be some good things that come from it. But on the flip side, it can also be a very volatile conjunction as well because it can indicate, yeah, conflict. It can indicate unexpected disruptions. It can indicate other things of a Martian nature, which tend to pertain to war and conflict, but it kind of gets amplified and magnified with Uranus, and in some ways made more destructive occasionally. So, one of the interesting things about that Mars-Uranus conjunction, though, is that every year when the US celebrates its birthday, it's unique, I think, among the countries because in the US we have this tradition going back, I think, to the very first birthday celebration of the US, where Americans all across the country start setting off fireworks. And that's actually a really perfect demonstration of the Mars-Uranus conjunction and the pivotal role that it plays in the birth chart, which is just like Americans celebrate their independence and they celebrate the birth of their country by like blowing things up and setting off these beautiful and dazzling explosions and stuff. But the other night I was watching, fireworks on the 4th of July like I do every year, and I was looking around from a really high place in my city in Denver and just seeing that like so many hundreds and hundreds of different neighborhoods everywhere I could see were all setting off their own fireworks, and then there were other fireworks displays. And so I got interested and I looked it up to see if this is like common in other countries or if the US was unique for it. And what was coming back was that the US really was unique in terms of the sheer magnitude of the number of like fireworks and explosions that are set off each year on the 4th of July. And I think that has a lot to do with that explosive combination that's built into the birth chart of the United States. All right, so Uranus takes 84 years to do a complete cycle through all of the signs of the zodiac and come back to where it started in the birth chart of something. So Uranus was first in Gemini during the Revolutionary War, and that sets up the basic framework for the country and the United States, and it's declaring itself independent from another country and sort of setting the stage, innovating in that way. But then what happens is about 84 years later, Uranus came back and moved into Gemini again from 1858 to 1866. And what's interesting is during that time frame, there was an astrologer named Luke Broughton, and he was in the 1900s. He became one of the most like the leading astrologer in America and one of the most famous astrologers in America and one of the most influential astrologers of his time frame. So let me pull up his dates just to give you more information about him. Luke Broughton lived from 1828 until 1899. And what's interesting about him is that he published an astrological periodical from 1861 until 1869, so that he was basically like publishing this astrological journal or periodical in the decade when the Civil War, like the build up to the Civil War, and then eventually during the Civil War itself. So the Civil War itself happened from April of 1861 until April of 1865. And what's interesting is if you read Luke Broughton's journal, he's like talking about this right from the very first issue of this journal, starting in 1861, that the threat of war is looming over the country and that it seems like it's heading in that direction. But in one of the journals in particular, it's volume two, uh, number two from February of 1861, he has this whole discussion about the planet Uranus and its transits through the sign of Gemini in US history. And Luke Broughton, as far as I can tell, was actually the first astrologer to note this correlation between Uranus and Gemini and major conflicts breaking out in the United States. And he partially based some of his predictions about an upcoming war, which turned into the Civil War, based on that transit of Uranus through Gemini. Because one of the things that he talks about in this article and that he could see at the time was how closely the transit of Uranus and Gemini coincided with the Revolutionary War back in the 1700s. So looking back about 84 years earlier, he could see how close that correlation was. And so based on that past correlation, he realized that that was what was coming up again in the very near future, and that it implied that another major war could be about to take place. But what's further interesting about his article is that he actually took it back further in terms of US history, and he noted that there was a period in the 1690s when Uranus was transiting Gemini, and he has a section in his article talking about different things that were happening at that time that he thought were relevant in his time as well. So he pointed out that there was like a conflict that was taking place, which is called, nowadays, it's called King William's War, and how this coincided pretty closely with Uranus and Gemini in the 1690s. He he also noted a few other things. He noted some things about the laws that were set up during that time frame and how that would end up influencing the later country in terms of the United States and what it would eventually become. Weirdly, he also noticed some anti-astrology and anti-fortune telling or like witchcraft type laws that were coming up back then with the Salem witch trials, and how he was experiencing some anti-astrology stuff during his time frame. So that's one correlation I'm actually a little nervous about, because I don't know if that's, I haven't looked at that correlation very much. And I hope that's not a recurrence, but that was one other thing that I noticed that he picked up on in terms of that time frame. So let me show really quickly his journal, because this is something that's out there in online that you can go and read a scan of in order to see how he talks about it. All right, so here's the journal where he first published this analysis, which is, again, it's from Broughton's Monthly Planet Reader and Astrological Journal, Volume 2, Number 2, published in Philadelphia, February 1st, 1861. So this is what, like 2 months before the Civil War breaks out. And he has this whole article about what he calls the planet Herschel, because back in the early, like the first century of after the discovery of Uranus, there were some debates about what to call it. And some of the astrologers and astronomers called it Herschel. So the article right at the top of the journal is the planet Herschel in the sign Gemini. And it's just so fascinating. At the very beginning of it, he says, in the January number of the Planet Reader, we stated that the sign Gemini rules the United States, and that when the planet Herschel entered that sign in 1775, the American Revolution broke out. And when Herschel got 9 degrees in Gemini, the Americans declared their independence. And when Herschel got out of that sign and entered Cancer in 1782, overtures for peace were made by the British government, which were accepted, and both nations desisted from hostile measures. And we went on to show that when Herschel entered Gemini again in 1859, that the present difficulties commenced by the Harper's Ferry after breaking out. And when Herschel got to 9 degrees of that sign, South Carolina declared her independence. And since our last issue, there have been other three of the southern states followed the same course. So he continues, he says, As it is said by astrologers that when the planet Herschel transits over any particular place in a nativity, such as over the 10th house or over the sun's place, it produces remarkable changes and unsettledness for that person. And likewise, when it's traveling through any sign which rules any particular nation or country, it produces very remarkable changes and unsettledness in that nation or country. It perhaps will not be uninteresting to the reader and to the student of astrology to refer back to the time when Herschel entered Gemini previous to 1775, which was in the year 1691, to see whether it produced any remarkable effects in this country or at that time or not. And to avoid any unfairness or equivocation, we will let history speak for itself. And then he does this long quote from like a history text about um, the charter being granted to Massachusetts, which added Plymouth, Maine, and Nova Scotia to the territory. And he goes on into this long thing, which points out essentially some similarities between even the previous Uranus and Gemini transit before the founding of the United States. So, his research partially shows, and you can take it back, that this goes back to some earlier base birth chart, even prior to the United States, that the pattern holds up in, so that it was something from very early on in the history that's still being carried forward, although we can see it especially when it comes to like the current incarnation of the United States as a country in the birth chart itself, with that Mars-Uranus conjunction with Uranus around 8 degrees of Gemini, which seems to be a particularly sensitive point, especially when Uranus gets back to that degree, but really for the entirety of the transit through that sign. So one of the things I was surprised by is just how he's really identifying the entire transit through the sign as being significant, and especially the transit to the exact degree. But already the concept of the United States being involved in major wars was established by this astrologer right on the cusp of the Civil War. So he's writing when some of the southern states had already seceded, and just 2 months before the war would really fully get going in April of 1861. So, I don't know if there's other people before him, but as far as I know, he seems to be the first astrologer that comes up with this observation, and he comes up with it right on the cusp of the Civil War, which is just incredible because that would become one of the most significant wars in US history. And I think that's important because it's not just that the US is involved in a war or any sort of war when the Uranus return happens, but it's literally the three most important wars in US history all took place during this transit, which is like the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II. So very occasionally, like I'll hear somebody try to dismiss this correlation and say, well, the US was involved in other wars, but not to this magnitude and not in terms of this significance, where if you ask any historian, for the most part, what are the three most significant wars in US history, it really comes down to these three in particular. And while somebody might question, like, what about World War One? Um, the U.S. got involved in World War One pretty late. Like World War One had been going on for a few years by the time the U.S. even enters it, and then World War One ends up wrapping up like a year, just about a year after the U.S. gets involved. So while that was a significant war, it wasn't as significant as World War Two. And in terms of the overall US history and in terms of the impact that it had on the United States as a country, these three wars of the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and World War II are just indisputably the most important conflicts in US history. So it's incredible to me to see this astrologer discovering this pattern as the US was on the cusp of World War II, and then basing some of his predictions about that war that was about to happen on that, and saying and predicting that a war was about to take place. So that's actually the earliest example I can find, and that sets up the precedent of astrologers uh, predicting and noticing this pattern, and then based on the historical pattern, starting to predict that a major war will occur the next time that Uranus is in Gemini, dating back to the beginning of the Civil War. All right, so the Civil War happens, and then you fast forward to the 1930s, the early 1930s, and there was a very famous astrologer in the early 20th century named Evangeline Adams. And I've done an entire episode on Evangeline Adams with my friend Christopher Renstrom, and we were basing some of our research on the work of another astrologer named Karen Christino, who's written multiple books about Evangeline Adams and just what a popular and influential astrologer she was in the early 20th century. So Evangeline Adams lived from 1861 to 1932. And 1932 is important because the year before she died, she published a book in the year 1931 that predicted that the US would be involved in a major war starting around 1942 based on the Uranus return of the United States. And the book that she wrote this in, it was actually in the introduction to her 1931 book, Astrology for Everyone. And I was researching this recently and I read the introduction. It'd been years since I read it, and I was blown away by what a like baller move it was when she made this prediction in the introduction to this book, because the way that she does it is just absolutely stunning. So I'm going to read part of that because it's so impressive and you can kind of get a sense for what I'm talking about. So at the beginning of the book, she has an introduction, and this is very much like a general introduction to astrology book. So she spends the majority of the introduction like talking about some pretty basic things. So she says this book attempts to tell in simple, untechnical language what astrology is and how it works. And then she introduces like the zodiac signs and their names. And then eventually she has this whole long section where she's talking about the birth dates, date ranges basically for the different sun signs. So, for example, she says, if you were born between May 22nd and June 21st, you are a Gemini person. Gemini is the third sign of the zodiac and is symbolized by the twins. Its natives are often brilliant, versatile, flexible, and changeable, sometimes dilettantes, often flirts. Gemini people are, in truth, twins, Castor and Pollux. And she just goes on and on. And introducing all these basic concepts. So eventually she gets to some of the later pages because the introduction is at least like a dozen pages long, maybe twice that. And then she starts talking about how the planets move through the signs of the zodiac and how you could conceptualize them like the hands of a celestial clock. Um, and then she's talking about the planets, and she starts talking about the concept of like transits. And then what's interesting is that when she starts getting towards the end of this introduction to this like general book on astrology, this basic book on astrology, and she writes it really well because she's writing this towards the very end of her life. She's a lifelong astrologer and teacher of astrology, but also a good like public communicator because she was really somebody who took advantage of like radio and had like a radio show about astrology and was very good at communicating complex concepts in really simple language. So that's one of the things that really strikes you about, especially the introduction to this book. Um, so she's talking about the movement of the planets through the signs, and then she says, in this chapter, I do not need to describe each of the planets and its effect on mankind. These descriptions are given in the next several pages, but I think she means chapters, but I do not wish to leave this subject at this point without giving you one universally known example, which will, I hope, clarify the whole problem. That example is the horoscope of the United States. She says, certainly nations have horoscopes, just as people do. France was born on such and such a date, Italy on another, Germany on still another, and our own country, as every American knows, on the 4th of July, 1776. All an astrologer needs to know to draw a horoscope of anybody or anything is this information about their birthday. It is better, of course, if she also knows the place and the hour, and in these matters too, it's possible to achieve scientific accuracy so far as the United States is concerned. For it's generally accepted, and properly so, I believe, that the life of the American nation dates from that moment in Philadelphia at 3:03 in the morning, when the signers of the Declaration of Independence reached a positive decision to declare to the world their independence of England. So Evangeline Adams uses the what's called the Gemini rising chart for the United States, which is almost the exact opposite time as the Sibley chart, because the Sibley chart is during the day, like later in the afternoon or evening, whereas the Gemini rising chart is curious because it's at like 3 o'clock in the morning. So this is where some of the debates about like the birth chart of the United States come in, and different astrologers have different opinions. But Luke Broughton, I think he used the Sibley chart, but he repeatedly said that Gemini was one of the main signatures for the United States. So I should confirm that, because he was certainly emphasizing the sign of Gemini and could see that it was super important for the United States. Evangeline Adams thought it was important, not just because of the Mars-Uranus conjunction, but also because she thought that Gemini was rising in the birth chart of the US. So she continues about the US chart. The sun was in Cancer when the United States was born, but Gemini, the third sign of the zodiac, was rising, as we astrologers say, at that moment of birth, and is therefore most influential in determining our destiny. Gemini is itself a very nervous, restless, versatile, and highly mental sign. The fact that the United States was born so strongly under its influence would be enough, according to astrology, to account for much which is significant in American character and history. But that is not all. The ruling planet of the sign Gemini is Mercury, the messenger of the gods, which governs the mind, the imagination, and the nerves. This combination of celestial influences explains why we are the world's greatest travelers, greatest advertisers, greatest salesmen, and why incidentally we're so subject to the American disease of nerves, quote unquote. Several important and influential planets were in the ascendant at the time this child among nations was born. Among them, Mars, Venus, and Jupiter. Mars is not only the god of war, but it is the planet which gives ambition, initiative, courage, and aggressiveness. It is not difficult, therefore, to see how this intrepid planet has placed its mark on our countrymen. Venus, although popularly known as the goddess of love, performs many other gracious duties in the astrological scheme of things. She governs musicians, painters, actors, and artists in general, and surely no modern nation has done more than America to encourage and reward these professions. She also governs makers of toilet accessories, clothing manufacturers, and dealers in articles of adornment, all of them activities in which America attained front rank. Jupiter, the third of this heavenly trio, is the most powerful and the most American because it gives honor, glory, wealth, and the most sought after thing in America, success. So she's delineating all these planets because in the Gemini rising chart, the using quadrant houses, Gemini and the Cancer planets all fall in like the first house, basically. Okay, so now finally, she gets to the very last paragraph of the introduction, and listen to this. It says, Uranus, the planet which discards worn-out customs and forms of government, which breaks bonds and often causes estrangements, was also rising when our country was born, making July 4th, 1776, the predestined moment for us to shake off the yoke of monarchy and to set up in the New World a new form of government. Uranus has also had a marked effect on our later national life, for it is the planet which rules inventions in general and electrical inventions in particular, fields in which American genius has set a new pace for the world. But not all of Uranus's influence is good. It is, as I have already said, the heavenly planet which stirs revolutions and rebellion. And it is a fair assumption that whenever it completes its journey through the 12 signs and returns to the sign Gemini, ruling the United States, a cycle which takes 84 years, we may expect trouble of some sort. Uranus was in Gemini in 1776, and we rebelled against England. Exactly 84 years later, in 1860, Uranus was in Gemini again, and we had a war between the North and the South. In 1942, Uranus again enters the sign Gemini. But I've said enough at this point to show you how the planets affect both character and destiny in their never-ending progression through the signs. And then it's a mic drop moment. She ends the introduction, and that's it. She was writing this in 1931, and she predicted when World War II would happen, when the US would enter into World War II, which then happened like 10 or 11 years after she published the book. And then she died the year after she published this. She died in 1932. So she didn't even live to see if her prediction would come true, but it very much did because basically the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and then immediately the US gets involved in World War II shortly after that, especially in 1942. So that is a baller move that she actually wrote that in the introduction, and I'm so impressed. And so yeah, it's a really cool like piece of astrological history just to give you some idea of how long astrologers have been using this cycle to not just study history, but also to make predictions. So super, super cool prediction on her part. And even the use of like the M dash is actually pretty funny in the writing. All right, so that sets up, the last time that we experienced this was World War II, and it set up a precedent that was just impossible to ignore. And by implication, by the time you get to the late 20th century and the early 21st century, um, I knew about this repetition, and I think most astrologers, certainly anybody that did mundane astrology or worked with the birth chart of the United States or other things like that, knew about this repetition. And naturally, it led one to wonder what would happen the next time Uranus would go into Gemini, starting in 2025 and going until 2033. So, my friend Nick Dagan Best and I, this is such a like key topic that it was one of the topics that I covered in one of my first episodes of the Astrology Podcast, which was episode 11 of the Astrology Podcast, titled The Astrology of Uranus and the United States, which was released on September 16th, 2013. And this was an episode where I was interviewing my friend Nick Dagan Best about a new book that he had just published called Uranus USA, where he went back and studied this repeating pattern of the US being involved in major wars every time Uranus was in Gemini. And he demonstrated, how closely the pattern held up, like how well it held up, as well as some of the birth charts of different people involved and how Uranus was hitting their birth charts in interesting and important ways in terms of some of the different people that were involved at crucial points, like Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or other figures like that, because often Uranus would be prominent in the charts of some of these people who were pivotal during the wars. So I want to play a little bit of a clip from that because in that clip, in the episode, it basically culminates after Nick and I talk about the historical recurrence of this transit in the three biggest wars in U.S. history. It's sort of naturally at the end, we end on Nick basically making a prediction and the inference being that a major war would begin after Uranus moves into Gemini in 2025, sometime during the course of this transit. So I'm going to play a clip from that episode now so you could listen to that discussion from 2013. And since this is so long ago, early in the history of the Astrology Podcast, I was only doing audio versions of the episodes and I wasn't doing video. So I decided to pick out a humorously old picture of me and Nick to go along with some visuals from that time frame, although the picture is a little bit older than 2013.
Sure, and yet, despite that, because of some of the clear patterns that you've discovered, and because of the similarity of some of the repetitions in terms of the events that tend to coincide with them, that does still seem to lead you inevitably to drawing some conclusions about the future when similar alignments or planetary transits will occur. For example, one that obviously comes up many times in your book is Uranus in Gemini, and I think it's been on a lot of people's minds for a while now that we're due for another Uranus return in the United States chart, and Uranus is not too far from going back into Gemini in just a few years now.
12 years from now, yeah. It'll be entering Gemini in 2025.
Okay.
I'll say that, I mean, having just talked about how I'm safe in talking about the history and and all this, I'll say this: I might not have written this book if we had not just gone through, if the zeitgeist had not just gone through that whole 2012 Mayan calendar thing. Because my sense is that, people have already, to the degree that people were going to be freaked out by that kind of thing, they've already gone through it. So it's a little safer for me to sort of pop up with this astrology book that by no means insists, but certainly suggests that the United States would be headed for a sort of a cyclical or thematic return during the cyclical return. In other words, when Uranus enters Gemini again in 2025, the book at least suggests or anticipates that there would be another one of these big wars, the result of which by the end in 2033 would see the United States becoming a different country in some fashion, redefining itself. Again, as Tom Paine said, having in its power to begin the world over again, which I think is was very prophetic of Mr. Paine.
Sure.
When it comes to the country, there's no way he could have seen ahead 200 years, but lo and behold, he's sort of did.
Sure. Yeah, and that's, the 2012, that's true, and definitely maybe we're in better shape now since everyone, perhaps, or at least some people, are feeling a bit burned by the 2012 hype and the fact that it came and went and nothing really happened, which I think a lot of people said. I mean, I said, I think you said, a lot of us were trying to be much more cautionary about that because of what a weak sort of astrological argument it was based on. This is a little different, though.
But I mean, at the same time that, the Mayan calendar scare was turned into a big blockbuster Michael Bay movie.
Right. Well, that was worth it. I mean, I enjoyed that film in terms of disaster films. So if that was the main thing that resulted in, then I appreciate it for that.
Right. Well, I mean, it's again, that something like that movie makes me feel a little safer about putting out my little astrology comic book that suggests that the United States might get into a war. First of all, I mean, the United States, like we said earlier, is almost always in wars, so it's not like that. It's not like that fact alone should necessarily be any more troubling to people than it already is. But the sort of the immensity, the larger consequences that seem to come out of the wars that occur when Uranus is in Gemini, is a little more sort of striking, and perhaps if you really think about it, it could be a scary thing or it could be a wonderful thing. The wars that I've discussed in this book are all really horrible events with just unthinkable levels of destruction. But there was reason for optimism at the end of these wars as well. They changed the nation, I think, in ways that I think most people would agree were really, positive in the long run, even though, unfortunately, they had to come at the expense of so many lives.
Sure. And we're talking about the Civil War and World War II.
Yeah, and the revolution. I mean, all three of them. They were bloody. They were horrible. A lot of innocent people suffered, and there was so much of it. Most of it is so needless. But once the war is over, that there are always these positive consequences coming out. So,
Like
I guess I would say,
desegregation at the end of or during the course of the Civil War and
yeah, yeah.
World War II, seeing the U.S. as the sort of remaining superpower.
Yeah, and also, of course, pulling it out of the Depression, which was, you know, um, pretty important in terms of where the nation was going to go down the road.
Sure.
Um, so I guess what I would say to anyone is if they were going to read my book and get all paranoid about it, to bear in mind that there's also that there's always light at the end of the tunnel. Maybe I hate to even sort of mention it. Maybe we are in for one of these just horrible experiences that the last three involved. But at the same time, if you're going to be if you're going to be paranoid and think negatively about all that, I would say try to balance that out with the understanding that in the big picture, these tend to improve life.
Sure.
And I'd certainly be very happy if none of this happens. If there's no war, in 2025 or any other time, that's fine with me. I just made the observation. It's by no means wishful thinking.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that's a good high note to end on, or sort of mixed, I guess. Some
Yeah.
dark possibilities, but also some positive ones.
Yeah, yeah.
In terms of a transformation of the country.
All right, so that was our discussion from 12 years ago, from 2013. And Nick and I did a more recent discussion from 2022, where we went into even more detail about Uranus return in US history, and also more detail about obviously some of the things we were anticipating then coming up with the current Uranus return, which at that point was then 3 years away. But I wanted to play the 2013 clip because just to show you, 2013 was such a different time when we were so much further away from the huge like constellation of different stuff that's come together now that seems so obvious and is so in front of our face at this point by today's July 6, 2025. So we have one of the things that we've been talking about for the past several years is how the pattern in US history set up a precedent where there had been two Uranus transits through Gemini where it was a major external conflict, which was a war with another country, which is, in the Revolutionary War, it was the US declaring its independence from Britain and fighting a war of independence during the Revolutionary War. Or during World War II, it was the US fighting against Nazi Germany and fighting against Japan. But then there was another scenario in the 1800s, which was an internal conflict, which was the Civil War, when the country turned on itself, with different Americans killing Americans. So, one of the things we've been aware of is that there was the potential for either one or potentially both to happen in this upcoming Uranus return of the United States from 2025 to 2033. And at this point, I think we can kind of see how the potential for both is very much present and seems very likely at this point because of the huge amount of both internal conflicts and tensions within the country and with respect to the government and where things are headed, but also a huge amount of external tensions that are building up in terms of the US and its relationship with different countries around the world, with, the US and Russia over the past decade, with the US and Iran, which the US just was involved in attacking last month in June, between the US and China as an emerging superpower that the US has been in tensions with and conflicts with at different points. We can see how all of these different things, both externally and internally, have been coalescing or constellating to bring us to the point we're at today. And now that we're at this point in history where we're heading into another one of these cycles of Uranus going through Gemini over the course of the next 7 to 8 years, basically from 2025 to 2033, the likelihood of a conflict seems so obvious and so inevitable at this point. But, even a decade ago, even a few years ago in like 2023, 22, it was like still something that seemed far away on the horizon, even though we could see the repetition and we could see the likelihood of it repeating again. And certainly back in 2013, it seemed even more distant and remote as a possibility way back then. And yet, um, yeah, the historical correlation seemed so compelling, and it seemed compelling enough, certainly for Nick to make that prediction back in 2013, and for that to now seem very prescient today, 12 years later, now that we're right on the cusp, or right on the precipice of moving into this new era and this new transit of Uranus and Gemini. So I wanted to give us some perspective though, and to show that this is something that astrologers, because there's a lot of talk about this already. There's been a lot of talk about it in anticipation of Uranus going into Gemini. There's going to be a lot more talk about it as things continue to get more and more tense, and as conflict eventually breaks out. Um, but I wanted to point out, from my perspective, partially not just as a practicing astrologer and somebody that's been around for the past couple of decades and is aware of the discussions that have been had in the lead up to this, but also as a historian of astrology, I wanted to demonstrate how this isn't like a new discussion that astrologers have just been having recently, now that Uranus is actually going into Gemini, but in fact, it's something that astrologers have been discussing since the 1860s, since the time of the Civil War, when the Civil War was breaking out, and the US, Uranus had recently returned to Gemini, and the US was right on the cusp of plunging into one of the most deadly wars in its history. The first astrologers, evidently Luke Broughton was one of the first, if not the first astrologer who noticed this correlation, both as a historical correlation and as something that was happening in his time that he could see, that was coinciding, that was a celestial movement that was coinciding with a very specific earthly event, and as well as a historical repetition. So this is part of how astrologers, it's not always how astrologers do predictions or develop predictions. Sometimes predictions are based on interpreting symbolism, but there's this other side of astrology, which is there's this empirical side to astrology sometimes, where some of the astrological predictions are based on seeing a transit coming up and going back and seeing what happened the last time that that same planetary alignment occurred. And by studying events in history, or by writing down and recording events and what planetary alignments coincided with major events in history, astrologers for many, many centuries, for thousands of years, have built up these large collections of observations, which becomes like this collective wisdom that is passed down from generation to generation of astrologers. And sometimes these correlations and these observations that past astrologers have made can be very powerful and very informative, because astrologers are sometimes people who are living through historical events, and they're documenting what the planets and what the sky was doing at that time, and how it was mysteriously mirroring events on Earth during some of the most important events in human history. And this is true in US history, but it also, like I documented in my episode on Mesopotamian astrology a couple of months ago, this goes back, 2, 3, 4,000 years to the Mesopotamian astrologers, who were also documenting important events in their time, like the astrologer who wrote down when Alexander the Great died and what the celestial alignments were that month when that happened, or other famous figures like, Julius Caesar or Charlemagne or other historical figures like that. There's always astrologers working in the background and paying attention to what's happening on Earth and what's happening in the sky at the same time, and then recording those things, and then hopefully, in some instances, passing them down to future generations so that later astrologers can use those same configurations to predict the future in their own time. So part of what I wanted to do is document that as we're on the cusp of moving into this, um, and to show that we'd been kind of anticipating this, the things that are about to happen for obviously for more than a decade now, and to pass that information on, and then hopefully other astrologers will be able to look back and kind of like marvel at it in the same way that we look back here and read what Luke Broughton wrote or what Evangeline Adams wrote, and that there's sort of like prescience to have that anticipation about what that transit would mean. And hopefully that, well, I should actually correct that, not hopefully, because obviously the ideal is not for either a major external conflict or internal conflict to take place in the United States, because I would prefer that not to happen. I'd prefer to be wrong about all of this and to have this be like the first time that that repetition doesn't take place and that the pattern is broken. But obviously, over the past decade, the closer and closer we've gotten to it, the more and more it seems like the pieces have fallen into place to bring about something that's very similar to the last three times that this happened in US history. And now, over the course of the next 7 years, we'll finally get to see what exactly that looks like, how difficult or how bad it is. But also, the other reason I played that clip is because Nick also tried to put a positive spin on it, which, we've also tried to do at different points. My friend Austin Kopic has also tried to do at different points when we talk about this transit, is that it tends to be an incredibly difficult one, and there's a lot of conflict and oftentimes a lot of loss of life, but then it's also a transformational transit where by the end of it, sometimes there are certain things that are improved or become better about people's lives, and sometimes the direction of the country going out of the transit on the other side of it, even though there's a lot of very difficult and tragic things that happen during the course of it. So sometimes there can be very positive things that happen. I mean, one of them, for example, was the Civil War and the end of slavery on the other side of the Civil War versus the status of slaves and of so many people in the United States prior to that time. So sometimes through these great conflicts, there can also sometimes be this energy of liberation that also comes with Uranus once you get to the other side of that, and once you sort of push through the period of struggle in order to achieve that. So that's one of my hopes in the best case scenarios about, even if the worst does come to pass, I'm still deeply hopeful that the precedent of some of the other instances also brings about some positive liberatory pieces on the other end of this transit, in addition to some of the other things that were occasionally positive during the course of those periods as well, such as obviously innovations in technology and communications and lots of other things like that, which we will also see intensify a lot during the course of the next several years. So I've talked about on the recent forecast episodes where I expect Uranus and Gemini to be major innovations in communication, in travel, the complete transformation and automation of local travel systems with like cars becoming fully automated. The advancement and acceleration of some of the things that's going to happen with artificial intelligence is probably very likely during the course of this transit, especially since Uranus will also be trining Pluto. And we've seen Pluto going through Aquarius over the past three years since around 2022, and how that's led to this sudden explosion of growth and this acceleration of artificial intelligence. And with Uranus moving into Gemini and trining Pluto, that will probably be one of the defining things I'm anticipating about this period that will come out of it, having deeply transformed society, probably in some instances in not good ways, but hopefully in other instances in positive ways that's actually constructive and useful, and hopefully improves society and humanity and human freedom and liberation in some ways, whatever downsides come along with that. So there's definitely some things to be hopeful for, but definitely some difficult potentials at the same time. So I think I'm going to leave it on that note. I would really recommend checking out not just the first episode that Nick and I did on the Uranus return of the United States, which was episode 11 of the Astrology Podcast, which is only available on the podcast website at theastrologypodcast.com. Go to the episodes page and just scroll to episode 11, and you'll see the episode titled The Astrology of Uranus in the United States. So that was the first discussion we did, and then we did a much more extensive discussion that was episode 376, which there's also a video version of on YouTube, titled The Uranus Return of the United States, which was released on November 19th, 2022. So for more about this cycle and how it's lined up in US history, I'd really recommend checking that episode out because it gives a very extensive treatment of this topic. But otherwise, I think I think that's it. I think that's all I wanted to say. So on to commemorate this huge historical moment as Uranus moves into Gemini. We're finally there. I want to wish everyone, the best of luck. I hope everyone can manage and navigate this as constructively as possible as we move through this historic era, probably both in United States history, but also potentially in terms of world history. I hope we can all navigate it as well as possible. And yeah, we'll see how things go and how things turn out. And I'll check in periodically, especially on the forecast episodes, to document and assess things and talk more about it. Oh, yeah, that's one last thing I almost didn't mention. I mentioned it briefly, but one of the things that Luke Broughton mentioned is how the Uranus degree was particularly sensitive, where Uranus in the US chart is at 8 degrees of Gemini. And while the entire transit is the entirety of Uranus going through the sign of Gemini for about 7 years, it's really especially also when Uranus will return to that exact degree around 8 degrees of Gemini seems particularly potent and sometimes particularly problematic in terms of what happens during those times, that the most intense phase sometimes coincides with the exact transit. And I think he notes this. I can't remember if Evangeline Adams notes that as well elsewhere. But that's important partially because while I do think the next year, once Uranus moves into Gemini, is going to be especially dramatic, I think things actually escalate and get heightened because my friend Austin Coppock recently pointed out that the solar return, the birthday of the United States in 2026, has a nearly exact Mars-Uranus conjunction right on July 4th. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so this is the chart of the moment, and Uranus we can see is at 2959 Taurus. That is so crazy. I'm going to animate the chart. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours. There it is. So Uranus will go into Gemini early on the 7th here in Denver. And I'm going to move it forwards because what happens is Uranus actually stations retrograde. It doesn't get very far into Gemini this year before it stations retrograde in September. Weirdly, that retrograde station, that first retrograde station, which will probably be the first retrograde station, is particularly loud. Usually it acts as an exclamation mark next to a planet when it stations retrograde for the first time in a sign. And it usually tells you what the rest of that transit is going to be all about the first time an outer planet stations in a sign. And what's notable about this is it actually is happening the same time as an eclipse because there's a lunar eclipse in Pisces that takes place around that time on September 7th, which seems very important. And then there'll be a solar eclipse in Virgo 2 weeks later. So that first Uranus station happens during eclipse season. So it's going to be particularly loud and prominent during that time. So we'll be paying very close attention to it. And then moving forward, Uranus retrogrades back into Taurus later this year so that it returns back to Taurus. It exits Gemini for just a little bit, but then it stations direct early next year and moves into Gemini again by, it looks like May of 2026. Yeah, by late April, early May of 2026, it moves back into Gemini. And then what is disturbing is Mars moves into Gemini. Yeah, it moves into Gemini in late June, June 29th. And then on July 4th, we see Mars has just passed a conjunction with Uranus, which looks like it goes exact around July 3rd and July 4th. Actually, is it early on the 4th? Yeah, it's super close. On the East Coast, it may actually happen on very early on July 4th, 2026. So on the one hand, that's going to be kind of a crazy time frame, late June and July of 2026, especially around that exact conjunction. But more broadly, it means that that Mars-Uranus conjunction is going to be baked into the solar return chart for the United States for that entire year of like July of 2026 until July of 2027. So that seems very notable as in terms of stamping the nature of a Mars-Uranus conjunction and having a recurrence of the natal Mars-Uranus conjunction that's in the US birth chart. In terms of Uranus getting back to the exact degree, it looks like it's here in this time frame. Oh, great. Yeah, like exactly a year later on that solar return, around July 4th, Uranus gets back to 7, 8 degrees of Gemini. Nice. Okay. So, in the Sibley chart, Uranus is at 8 degrees and 55 minutes of Gemini. So it looks like it's right after that solar return later in July, that 2027, that the Uranus return goes exact, I believe, for the first time. So that means that's going to continue to be very potent, not just the solar return chart from July of 2026, which seems especially combative because Mars is also conjunct Uranus, and the potential for conflict seems incredibly heightened in that solar return year from July 2026 until July 2027. But then Uranus will still be at its exact return shortly after the July 2027 Independence Day and solar return chart. So that'll then be stamped into the entirety of that next year as well. And then Uranus is still retrograding over that degree, 2027 through 2028. It looks like it goes exact again what is that? April, May 2028. Uranus is exactly returning again and is again hitting a peak point. And then I see that Mars goes into Gemini again not long after that. So we get another Mars-Uranus conjunction. This one looks like a Mars-Uranus-Mercury conjunction that's particularly problematic around June 23rd. So late June of 2028, especially. Um, yeah, basically June of 2028 through July of 2028. And then that leads us to the next solar return where it builds in another Mars-Uranus conjunction into the solar return chart for the United States starting July 4th, 2028. So again, it then re-stamps a very combustive, sort of explosive conjunction into that solar return chart for another year. So that's not great, to put it mildly. And then, yeah, we're still only halfway through the transit by this point. By the time we're getting into like 2029, Uranus is starting to get into later degrees of Gemini before stationing direct. And I'm going to fast forward here because at some point Uranus will start hitting the natal Mars placement of the US around this time, around when it gets around to 21 degrees of Gemini. And that is another sensitive and combustible point in the US birth chart. So it's not just the Uranus placement at 8 degrees of Gemini, but it's also the Mars placement, which let me show that. There it is. So Uranus at 8 degrees of Gemini in the US birth chart and Mars at 21 Gemini. So let's switch back to the animation. I'm sort of doing this on the fly. I haven't looked at all of this in as much detail as I would like yet. So I apologize for the, um, like, I don't know, not as prepared presentation of this piece as it could have been, but I just realized at the end we could look at this also to give some time frames. Because one of the things I did see, and Nick and I talked about this in an episode on artificial intelligence and astrology a few years ago, is when Saturn goes into Gemini later in this period in the early 2030s, there's some interesting combinations between Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto, and that trine that's taking place. So I'll skip over talking about this. So we can see here for the first time, Uranus goes into Cancer in 2032. So we start getting towards the end of that transit, but then Uranus retrogrades back into Gemini in 2033 before eventually stationing direct and departing from Gemini for the final time in May of 2033. And then that's the end of the transit. So that gives you kind of an overview of what the transit actually looks like, is it's going to be this process that's going to come in waves of Uranus going back and forth over different points in the US birth chart. It's going to be going over different points in different people's birth charts, including world leaders and the leaders of countries, but also in terms of individual people who will be affected by that transit are going to be getting, hit by Uranus going over certain degrees in their chart at different points. And then we're going to have some particularly tense and sort of combustible and explosive periods when we have some of those Mars-Uranus alignments, especially those two that are taking place and that are going to get built into the solar return chart in, it looked like 2026 and 2028. So that also seems problematic and seems to really point to and focus in on some specific timeframes that are going to be important in the not too distant future. So yeah, that's kind of an overview. I'm going to save a more detailed treatment, and at some point I'll try to do a more detailed treatment of the future transits and what we're looking at over the next several years for another episode. This one was really supposed to be more retrospective, but I thought I would throw that in at the end just to show you a little bit of what some of the transits are looking like. All right, so thanks for watching this episode and this discussion. Shout out to my friend Nick Dagan. Be sure to check out his website and some of those different discussions that him and I have had in the past, because he's done more on this topic than any other astrologer that I know. So I wanted to shout him out in terms of his research on this and some of the predictions that he's made in the past. But otherwise, I think that's it for this episode of the Astrology Podcast. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time. If you're a fan of the podcast and you'd like to find a way to help support my research, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to subscriber benefits such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend live recordings, the monthly electional astrology podcast, an exclusive podcast series called the Secret Astrology Podcast that's only available to patrons, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to the patrons on my producers tier, including patrons Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bazbaz, Kwatsi Alabarahu, Annie Newman, Ginger Sodlier, Berlin West, and Nikki Crawford. People often ask me if I'm available for consultations, but unfortunately I'm not right now because the podcast takes up so much of my time. However, I did create a consultations page on the Astrology Podcast website that has a list of astrologers that I recommend for astrological consultations. You can find that at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software we use here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is astrology software for the PC. You can get a 15% discount by using the promo code AP15 at the website alabe.com. For Mac users, I recommend the software AstroGold for Mac OS, which is astrology software for the Mac computer made by the creators of SolarFire for the PC. You can get a 15% discount with the promo code AstroPodcast15 through their website at astrogold.io. If you're really looking to deepen your studies of astrology, then I would recommend signing up for my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course in ancient astrology where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, plus monthly webinars and Q&A sessions, and then at the end of the course you get a certificate of completion saying that you studied with me if you pass the final written test. Find out more information at theastrologyschool.com.